Okay, this is an open invitation, an open letter to Angenette Levy and Alex Caprariello to come forward and let the public know who they actually interviewed when they claim that they interviewed the private driver that took Kaylee and Maddie home the morning of November 13th, 2022. Because nothing in those interviews that you did matches with the real Eric Gower, who is listed in the legal documents as being the private driver. So if you could possibly let us know, did you check ID? Did you match up that it was actually this person talking to you? Was the interview done over the phone or was it done in person? Did you see his face? Because there's a lot of questions going around about this. Let's get started. So we'll start with this highlighted part here that I put. The man who did not want his name used read the affidavit charging Brian Kohberger with felony burglary and 4 counts of first-degree murder, except his name was unredacted in the affidavit that was released on the Pennsylvania website. So his name was already out there. And I would assume he knew that, so that's interesting that he's saying he didn't want to be named. And then he said he was surprised but exceptionally glad that some form of resolution is forming. He said he was somewhat stunned to learn that Kohberger, who maintains he did not commit the murders, lived near him in Pullman, Washington. But that's interesting because Gower, the real Eric Gower, lives in Moscow, Idaho, and has lived in Moscow, Idaho. He's never lived in Pullman. So this doesn't match up at all. It says he lived 1,200 feet from my front door. I spent 6 weeks trying to convince my wife there was not a threat and that I was wrong. Except he didn't live 1,200 feet from Kohberger. As I said, the real Eric Gower lives in Moscow. Also, his wife works for Moscow police. So it seems a little weird he would be spending 6 weeks trying to convince his wife there wasn't a threat. Then this next part says the driver spends much of his day shuttling people around town. Except that's not true either. That's not what he does for a job. The real Eric Gower works as a trio coordinator for University of Idaho, so the high school outreach program, and he was also getting his PhD during that time as well. So his job was not driving around town. That was something he was doing in the evening as a University of Idaho employee, that they would help out. Another University of Idaho employee had explained it to me that they would rotate with different employees that volunteered to help drive students home at night after they've been drinking. So that wasn't his job. He didn't spend days shuttling people around town. So who is this person that you interviewed? And talking about how he was keeping an eye out for the car, and claims he spotted it at Kohberger's apartment building. So what was he doing driving around in Pullman looking for the car? Did he really call the tip line? Did he really write down the license plate number, the real Eric Gower, or is it this person who turned it in that talked to you? Here's another thing that doesn't make sense to me. It says after learning the names of the student victims, he said he went to Moscow police and provided a receipt showing he'd purchased fast food after dropping them off. But the thing is, the murders didn't happen until after 4 a.m. So if he went and got fast food right after dropping them off, how would that be an alibi? That's another sign to me that this is not the real Eric Gower that you interviewed. It sounds like this person was just using things that were in the news before the affidavit actually came out. And so it sounds like this person really believed the murders took place right after the girls got dropped off and not what we learned when the affidavit came out, that it actually happened after 4 a.m. The next thing that's a red flag is he says for sometime afterward he felt guilt because he had driven Mogan and Gonsalves home that night, only to learn days later that they had been killed. How did he only learn that days later when his wife works for Moscow police? You would think that this is something he would have known about immediately. Also, he's an employee of University of Idaho, which means he also would have gotten the vandal alert text message, because not just students get that, employees get that too. And all staff would have had messages going out to them about how to handle classes and everything else for the upcoming week. So again, doesn't sound like this is the real Eric Gower you'd talk to. Now, this makes no sense either, because in the previous article, he says he didn't learn about it for days. But in this one, it says, when I saw the news on Monday, it occurred to me I was in the neighborhood, but that was before they'd released any names. Well, they released the names on Monday, so I'm not quite sure what he's talking about. They did an official news, or well, not the news conference yet, but the press release. They put out a press release on Monday with the names of the 4 victims. So then he goes, as soon as I knew for sure it was the girls, I went to police. But again, his wife works for Moscow police, so you'd think he would have known all of that. It's not adding up. It's not making sense. And here we go again. He said he swiftly was eliminated from inquiries, having provided officers with a wealth of data and a time receipt from the Taco Bell to where he went after dropping the girls back home. Except Taco Bell was not open at the time the murders took place. Jack in the Box is the only restaurant around Pullman, Moscow that was still open. So a receipt from Taco Bell wouldn't have been an alibi. Again, this sounds like somebody who was not the actual driver, who went to the media pretending to be him, and because they thought that the original news reports of the murders occurring around 3 a.m. was when it actually happened, he thought he could just lie his way through this interview. It's just really weird. And then he's like, I took about a week off of driving when I just stepped back from it all. Well, yeah, that week was kind of coming up into Thanksgiving break, so that could really be Gower there, but I doubt it. I just don't think somebody who doesn't even do that as full-time would have been like, yeah, I took the week off. Yeah, that's another red flag to me. And then he talks about how law enforcement is not communicating with the community, but yeah, his wife works for Moscow PD. Make it make sense. Like right here, do you think that somebody whose wife works for Moscow PD would make this comment? Most of us have very little faith in the MPD. We can't tell if we're watching qualified investigators who have a handle on the situation, or if they are completely at a loss and grasping for straws. I don't know, that just does not seem like the statement that the wife of an employee of the police department would make. Now, here's something else. He's claiming he didn't know who they were right away, but yet we know Olivia Gonsalves, Kaylee's sister, reached out to him. And he's who told Olivia about the Grub Truck Twitch stream. So obviously he knew that it was Kaylee and Maddie that had been murdered when he was talking to Olivia. So it makes no sense that he said he didn't know for a week who they are.
NewsNation's Alex Caprariello spoke with the driver about any details he had to share about that night. Alex?
Natasha, good evening to you. For the very first time, we're hearing from this rideshare driver who picked up Kaylee and Maddie right there on the side of the road on the night of the murders. Now, his testimony is incredibly important because it helps build additional context about that ride, as well as establish credibility to the timeline that the police have established.
NewsNation tracked down and spoke to the Uber driver who was likely one of the last people to see Idaho murder victims Kaylee Gonsalves and Maddie Mogan alive. In an exclusive conversation with the driver, who asked to remain anonymous, he says he knows Maddie, Kaylee, and Xana and shared what he remembered about the ride, a drive he says he thinks about every single day. I have a very good memory, the driver tells NewsNation. I wasn't followed. There was no one there. There was absolutely nothing strange about that street. It was just a normal night on Greek Row. He says Kaylee and Maddie were not nervous or apprehensive in any way. The driver turned himself into the police days later, sharing his GPS coordinates and alibi, critical evidence to prove his innocence.
So Alex, who did you really talk to? Because you didn't post a face. You didn't even use an altered voice. Nothing. For all we know, you could have made that up. And no, I'm not accusing you of that. I believe you really did speak to someone, but I don't believe you spoke to the real Eric Gower. I think you and Angenette Levy, who wrote the print articles, got duped by somebody. Because all that information that person stated in those interviews was things that were already publicly available. It was everything that had come out in press releases and in news articles. And then after the affidavit fact came out, then none of that really matched up with what the person was saying, like the Taco Bell receipt, that he went and got food right after dropping them off, etc. That doesn't match up with the timeline of when the murders were for that to be an alibi. And then that he spends his days driving people. That's not what he does. That's not his full-time job. He doesn't live in Pullman. As I said before, he lives in Moscow and always has. So that doesn't make sense. I think you guys got duped by somebody, and I would love to know what your vetting process was and who you actually talked to, because maybe that person has a little more information that we should know, possibly. Just saying. But I'm pretty sure you guys got duped. But let me know.